that is why I was partially asked to do this talk is some of the work that I'm doing with the foundation and relating to birds and what we understand from these birds about our environment. So what I do for the foundation is I work to ensure that the property that the foundation has, which is in Riel County, it's about 1,900 acres on the headwaters of the Frio River. I work to ensure that that property is healthier and more beautiful in 10, 50, or 100 years than it is today. So the foundation primarily is a retreat center and hosts guests out to this property through 5 different programs. We have a foundation camp program, which is a free camp and partners with area nonprofits and church groups and other organizations like that. We have an adult retreat center, we have a family camp, we have a youth camp, and we have an outdoor school program. So through all of those programs, we bring over 25,000 guests a year to the property with the goal to cultivate wholeness in people and institutions for the transformation of communities. So with that, the foundation is seeking to ensure that we can sustainably, for the next 100 years and beyond, bring that many guests to the canyon so we can continue to carry out our primary mission. So that's where my job comes in, and that is to help develop long-term management and stewardship plans that seek to make sure that we can do this sustainably. We have a land and a water and environmental stewardship plan that are all long-term management plans seeking to be on a 100-year timeline. And through those, our goal is, as far as the land and the water and the health of our physical property, we have defined health as diverse, balanced, robust, and native. So we are working to make sure that this 1,900 acres is diverse, balanced, robust, and native. And part of that is knowing where we are today so that we know where to go in the future, and so that future stewards can have this information, have access to this information, so they can know if those goals were met. And so we've been working the last several years to make sure we have all the baseline data about the property as it is that we need to measure these goals. And so with specifically the diversity piece of our measures or metric of land health, we have conducted some comprehensive bird surveys. A few years ago, we brought out a biologist, and he set up 25 or so points throughout the property. And he came out every season that year, and he just surveyed all of those 25 points to develop a baseline list of all of the birds that are on the property. And we're doing this, and since then we've added to the list as we've found more birds and just spent more time on the property looking for birds specifically. And we do all this so that the idea is that with future stewards, they will have this list in hand, know what birds were present in 2015 or 2020, and they should be able to see if our ecosystem and vegetation is actually more diverse, then that will be demonstrated in the bird life and the variety of habitats that the property has, and also the robustness of those species. There would be more birds in theory. And as we seek to make sure that the property is native and that we remove non-native invasive species, birds benefit from that. And bringing balance to the land through wildlife management, controlling our deer population so that we get hardwood trees resprouting, for example. All of these things are connected, and birds are indicators, or one of our indicators, my favorite indicator of if we are truly achieving this goal. So that's sort of why we are doing this, and that is these surveys are what got me really specifically interested in birds and has really cultivated my interest in birds. And that's all I'll say about my work for the foundation. But I just wanted to provide that context to know that that has informed this talk and my understanding of what birds can tell us about the environment. So now, for anybody that joined late, thanks for joining us. Kevin Wessels here. We just finished our introduction, and now I'm going to talk about why birds are indicator species. Here's a picture of me at the foundation property doing some of these bird surveys. So birds as indicators, what is an indicator species? And an indicator species is an organism that serves as a measure of the environmental conditions that exist in a given locale. A different definition and a different way to say that is an indicator species is a species whose status provides information on the overall condition of the ecosystem and of other species in that ecosystem. They reflect the quality and changes in environmental conditions, as well as aspects of community composition. So I have a few pictures here of some birds. Top left there is a whooping crane, some whooping cranes, which we have in Texas. The bottom left is a Kirtland's warbler, which we do not have in Texas. And then on the right is a golden-cheeked warbler, which is a native Texan, a very special bird, which I'll talk more about towards the end of the talk. But these are all three endangered or formerly endangered species that, regardless of their status, are imperiled and have needed help. And so birds are indicators. The first reason birds are indicators is because people enjoy observing them. And I put these pictures here because these are all birds that people have observed so much that we've realized that they are imperiled and need our help. And I just think that all these birds on here are so beautiful, and it makes sense to me that a reason that birds are indicators is because they're easy to monitor and because people enjoy observing them, as you can see just by their beauty. Let me go back here. Another reason that birds are indicator species is because they are well distributed. So with some exceptions, bird populations are all over the planet, and they provide easily measurable clues to habitat quality across the world. So not only are they easy to observe and fun to observe and easy to monitor, they're also well distributed, which makes them another good indicator species. A third reason that birds are indicator species is because they're well studied and understood, which again ties into the fact that they're well distributed and enjoyable to watch. They're barometers all over the world in every natural system, and we have learned a lot about birds, and we have been able to learn from our mistakes and adapt our management strategies and multiply our stewardship successes because we understand birds relatively well. The fourth and final reason of why birds are indicator species is because they are relatively sensitive to environmental change. I will talk a little bit more about this as well, but DDT is an example of an environmental toxin that birds were more sensitive to than we knew, and they showed us that, and therefore they were a flagship to these environmental changes that were happening. And another example is just habitat loss. A lot of species, including birds, just respond very directly to habitat loss. If you destroy their habitat, they will respond, and they will let you know that they suffered from that, and that is showing that they are sensitive to environmental change. So the four reasons that birds are indicator species is that they are easy to enjoy, or they're enjoyable to observe and easy to monitor. They're well distributed, they are well studied and understood, and they are relatively sensitive to environmental change. So that is why birds are indicator species. Now I want to talk a little bit, if we are to observe birds, to learn from them and learn about our environment from them, I wanted to talk a bit about how to observe birds. This is more just me sharing some of the resources that I'm aware of that are very helpful and make birding fun. I have a list here of several different guides that I use for identifying birds. So the first thing we need to do when observing birds is to just look at them and identify them. Here I have on the top left the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They have a app called Merlin Bird ID. This is a fantastic app that I use all the time. It will actually help you identify a bird. You can put where you are, when you saw it, what it was doing, what the primary colors were, and it will generate some guesses for you on what it likely could be. And that is an app I use all the time. Another really good source of learning how to identify and getting help identifying birds is iNaturalist, which I have here on the left below the Merlin picture. iNaturalist is a bit different. It's not just for birds. You can put any species in there, and it's a community of conservationists and naturalists that if you can snap a picture of any species, you can post it to iNaturalist, and they will help you identify what that is. And that actually helps with citizen science, and folks use that for different studies and understand species distribution and a variety of things better because of applications like iNaturalist. Birds of the World is also by Cornell Lab of Ornithology. This is a great source. This is a paid subscription, but it literally has information on every bird in the world, I'm fairly certain, and it for sure at least has every bird in North America as a good start. More information than you could digest, and so it's a very go-to source for any question you would have about a bird or bird habits or habitat or life cycle, any of that. Another great field guide is the National Audubon Society's phone app, shown on this phone picture here with the heron. If you like physical guides, the Sibley Birds guide is a great one. David Allen Sibley's illustrations are really beautiful and just well laid out. So I just wanted to share those resources. If we are to learn from birds, and not everyone on here is a bird expert, these are some really great sources to seek out to help you identify birds so that you can begin learning more about them. And as you identify them, there's some overlap here, but more organizations that I just wanted to share that are doing really great work and really good bird conservation, but just have a variety of resources for you so that once you have identified birds or want to learn more about birds, you can seek out any of these. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology is a really great resource, as well as Audubon and some of these other on here they're all very good organizations. I'll leave this up just for one more second so that you can write any of these down if you are. So if we have identified birds, a next step to learning what birds can teach us about our environment is once you have the tools to identify birds, you will need to know where birds are or figure out how to get birds to you. So I've included some resources here. The best one probably that is the most important is eBird. It does not give back to the user as much as the user gives to it. So a lot of the studies that I'm referencing in this talk, and just a lot of information comes from eBird. eBird is a way for anybody who likes watching birds to sort of give back to the bird community. You're able to track and record what birds you see, when and where, and this information is used by scientists all over to help understand birds better and help us understand what birds are teaching us about the environment. If you do want to use eBird in a way that gives back to yourself more and makes it a little bit more user-friendly, I wanted to point out the app above it is called Bird's Eye. This is also a subscription app. eBird is free. Bird's Eye is a paid subscription, but it takes observations from eBird it helps you spatially understand when and where you could see birds. And you can look up locations and bird hotspots, and you can look up birds within 10 miles of your location, and understand just how common they may be and when you may be able to see them. Another way to understand birds, but then also give back to the science community of helping provide data, is Project Feeder Watch, which is also by Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They send you a packet with lots of great resources, and then you can observe birds as you do and enjoy, and actually put that information into Project Feeder Watch, and it will help inform some of these studies in this talk. And then the last resource on here is a book called Attracting Birds in the Texas Hill Country by Rufus Stevens and Jan Reed. It is a local, really great book with lots of information about how to create a bird-friendly habitat, whether you have 1,000 acres or 1/10 of an acre in a city lot. There's information for everybody in here that wants to learn more about attracting birds, and it's a great resource. So now that you know some tools on identifying birds and either going to where birds are or bringing birds to your backyard, I wanted to give a little bit of a more deep reference on seeing birds. This is the average peak migration dates for birds through the US. And you can see much of Texas is between the end of April and the beginning of May. And so I just wanted to provide that chart, that there are actual seasonal times that are better times to see birds than others. And then I also wanted to point out this program called Birdcast. It's actually shows migrations of birds based on satellite data, and folks actually use this with current weather to understand when the most birds might be in their backyard or at a favorite bird hotspot. And so it's an interesting tool that I myself haven't explored much, but I just wanted to have that as a reference for anybody who is seeking out birds. Excuse me. I also wanted to briefly discuss backyard birding. I've been doing a lot of this myself recently. And birds in your backyard can actually tell you a lot about your own little piece of property, even if you only have a lot in town. Birds in your backyard, all birds need food, water, cover, and a place to raise young. And ideally, sustainable practices can complement these 4 things. But these are the 4 pillars of what a bird needs. And there are birds that live in our backyards year round, and there are birds that nest in our backyards. And so knowing about these 4 things can actually inform you about your habitat. So for example, birds need food. If you have some birds coming to your backyard but want more, possibly you need food or different food. Birds love native species. Birds are accustomed to native species. And so if you have water and you have cover and you have a place to raise young in your backyard, but you don't have birds, then that may inform you about your local environment, that you have too many non-native or invasive species. So the application of what birds could be teaching you in your own backyard is that perhaps you need to replace some non-native species with native species, or perhaps you need to provide water, clean fresh water, or cover. I know a lot of folks like a clean understory that's park-like with no vegetation under trees, but a lot of birds actually need dense cover, dense vegetation as cover or as a place to put nests and raise their young. Or you can supplement a place to raise young with a birdhouse. So I have a reference here. This is called Nest Watch. It is also by Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And they have an interactive tool called Right Bird, Right House. where you can actually put where you live and what your habitat is, and it will generate a list of birds that nest or reasonably could nest in your backyard, and will provide you free plans on how to build a nest box and provide lots of information on best practices. And I will say a lot of bird boxes that you would buy at the store are more cute than they are practical. So this is really just a good source on the most practical and sort of scientific way to build a bird box to provide a place to raise young in your backyard. So I just wanted to say, even if you don't have property or a big area, even your backyard can teach you from birds about the space based on either a lack of birds is telling you something, or a multitude of birds. There's something to learn from them, even in a backyard. And if you need more information and don't know much about plants, National Audubon Society has a website called Plants for Birds. This is a great resource similar to the Right Bird, Right House. You can put in your location and it will generate a list of native species that would grow in your yard. And a really neat thing is that it actually shows you what birds and other species could benefit from the presence of this native species in your yard. So this is a really great way to learn about the plants in your yard and also the birds in your yard, and know that if you wanted to help provide food for wrens, which I will talk about more later actually, planting an American beautyberry, for example, would be a great thing to do, and you could build a bird box. So with all of that, that is how you can observe birds and identify birds and know where and when to go to see birds, or how to attract birds to your backyard and learn about them even in your own local context. And with all of that, there's been some studies that are largely from some of these things that we've talked about, such as Feeder Watch or Nest Watch, or a variety of citizen science programs, that has informed a recent study from 2019 that actually shows that 2.9 billion birds, there was a net loss of that many birds since 1970. So today in 2020, there are approximately 2.9 billion birds less than there were in 1970. And this shows sort of the biggest picture of what birds could teach us as far as environmental change, that something's going on in North America to cause that same number is essentially 1 in 4 birds to be gone since 1970. So I'll go a bit more into some of the information of that, but I just wanted to share the sort of biggest high level information is on this scale of what we can learn from birds, is that there are things happening in North America that are causing birds to be in serious decline. So with that, I will now transition into some specific examples of what birds can teach you and the lessons that I am taking from these specific bird stories. I'll start with possibly the most famous bird indicator species story, and that is the canary in the coal mine. In the 1800s and earlier days, canaries were used to fly into a coal mine to go ahead of the miners to try to detect any carbon monoxide or other toxic gases that may be harmful to humans and would be harmful to the birds. So the saying canary in a coal mine is from an actual application of coal miners using birds to tell them of environmental toxins that may lay ahead for them as they proceeded into a mine. Another very tragic but famous example is the passenger pigeon. So it was estimated that in the 1800s, there were 5 billion individual passenger pigeons. And in 1850, there's a report that there's flocks of millions of passenger pigeons flying overhead that literally took hours to pass and kind of blocked out the sky and made it dark and blocked the sun. And yet by 1914, the last passenger pigeon died in captivity. So passenger pigeons partially became extinct through land clearing, as land was cleared and consolidated. Their habitat was consolidated, their nest where they nested and roosted. And it was cleared for cultivated lands, and then their consolidation made their numbers really high in the forests near these cultivated areas, which then made them become pests. And so they were hunted for that. And then they were also just hunted for meat and shot and taken to markets in town. And there's just remarkable stories about the number of passenger pigeons killed in any given day. And obviously it was an extreme amount for there to have been 5 billion individuals, and then in a matter of years to be extinct. So what that tells us is that hunting regulations are needed, and that capture and use regulations are needed to ensure that our resources are protected. And what we learned from the passenger pigeon, what this bird is telling us about our environment, is that we can't just continuously take from the environment, and that we need restrictions and we need guidelines on how to steward our resources. Another example of what birds can tell us about our environment comes from DDT. So DDT was used to spray insects, mosquitoes for malaria. And this was believed to be a safe chemical. And then it was found that this pesticide accumulated in the food web and persisted in soil and sediment, and was indirectly affecting birds. So bald eagles and ospreys and pelicans and other birds of prey suffered as their eggshells thinned due to the persistence of this chemical in their food chain as bugs that eat mosquitoes were eaten by birds that eat those bugs, and the level of this chemical just built throughout the food web, eventually leading to some severe declines. Fortunately, many of these birds have recovered, but this shows us the sensitivity of birds to environmental toxins, and that we can learn about controlling and proper use of those toxins through birds. We can also learn about changes, long-term changes, whether that's in climate or breeding grounds or habitat from birds. So I have a specific example here from the EPA. It's a study showing that among 305 North American bird species that were here in the winter in December to January, the center of abundance of their range, of their territory habitat, moved northward by more than 40 miles between 1966 and 2013. So a changing climate and increasing temperatures would be expected to result in climate zones moving poleward, and that an associated shift in the geographic ranges of bird species would be moving north. And there's evidence of such shifts, such as this study. And then there's also evidence that from a different study of 59 North American bird species, that indicates that this movement is not easy. In these 59 bird species that were studied, it took about 35 years for the birds to move far enough north for winter temperatures just to match where they had historically lived, where they had just left. So I wanted to provide a few examples, kind of bring this less abstract to some of my own experiences. This is a Audubon's oriole. I have a picture here. I don't know when this range map is from, but it's on the database that I mentioned earlier, Birds of the World. And it's an older range map. And you can see that the Audubon oriole was only known to occur in very South Texas. And here's its range today. And I personally have seen this bird even just northwest of this green shape in Real County. And I know I've seen reports on eBird of it being seen in Kerrville area. And here's a different view of that same distribution. So that's even probably not that long. In fact, I was just looking in a bird field guide from the National Geographic Society from 1987, and it showed that it didn't even have a range map for the Audubon's oriole, and just said that it was known to very South Texas. A similar example of that is the great kiskadee. I was recently on the Devil's River, and I actually just saw this bird. It's a beautiful big bird. I think it does well around people and expands with cities and the expansion of people. But I have a old record here that I also got from Birds of the World. And the study from 1974 is referencing a early specimen from North Valverde County on the Devil's River from 1888, saying that it may represent extralimital wandering. And I know 1888 is a long time ago, but I have a range map here in the top right corner that is also from that National Geographic Society field guide from 1987 or so. And it shows its interpretation of the range for the great kiskadee. And then I have a star placed where the area that I just recently saw it. So those are just some examples, even from not so long ago, of birds shifting north in their range. There are some possibly more alarming thoughts about this. That's another example that's relatively close to home. In Big Bend National Park, there is a breeding population of the Colima warbler. I have its distribution map here. You can see it is just barely in Texas, and that's the only spot in all of the US that it occurs, and the rest of its range is in Mexico. And here in the bottom left, under the habitat title, it shows that their ideal elevation is 1,500 to 3,200 meters. And Emery Peak, which is the highest peak in the Chisos Mountains, where this Colima warbler is 2,300 meters. So there's this idea called escalator to extinction. And I'm not saying the Colima warbler is going extinct, but the idea is that as birds have to retreat to higher elevation, if they are already hilltop species that are on the mountain and in the highest elevations, that they have nowhere to go to escape raising temperatures. And so we could learn from the Colima warbler that if the temperature continues to rise and it is only has 2,300 meters of elevation until it's reached the highest peak in Texas, then we may soon have the population that is in Texas retreat into the mountains of Mexico, where it can get the elevation that it needs. Another example of what birds can teach us about our environment is the whooping crane. Texas is fortunate to have a wintering population of the whooping crane. The whooping crane is a very special species. In 1941, there was only 16 birds known to exist in the world. And today there's over 800. And about 500 of those winter in Aransas National Wildlife Refuge off the Texas coast. And you can actually go visit those birds and see them on some boat tours. And it's fun to do. But we actually, here in Kerrville, have an opportunity to help steward that population. The area of the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge where they winter is made up of brackish water, which is water that is a mixture of saline water from the sea and fresh water from our rivers. And you can see on this map here that the San Antonio, Guadalupe River basins actually provide the fresh water for the bay where these whooping cranes occur in the winter. And so Kerrville, that I have pointed out on the map there, is actually contributing important water to the bay to provide the salinity that the blue crabs in the bay need, which is the food source for the whooping cranes. So if there was not the flow of fresh water from Kerrville and the Guadalupe River and San Antonio River, then the blue crabs may not have the appropriate amount of salinity in their brackish waters, and then that's one less food source for the whooping crane. So our stewardship of our uplands and our water conservation practices and the way our lifestyle and the way we live up here in Kerrville and any dams along the river and all of that is indirectly contributing to the success of the whooping crane, which is highly rare and endangered. However, I also learned from that there's a whole nother habitat that the whooping crane needs. The population that winters in Aransas also goes up to Canada for the breeding season. And so there's a whole variety of conservation things that need to be happening up there to ensure that the population from the wintering grounds in Texas has suitable breeding habitat. So there's a lot we can learn from these birds. And I have here just some records of drought, and it's the percent area of Texas that was in the various drought categories over the last several years. And so just thinking about our water conservation and what we can learn about the whooping crane's needs in context of things out of our control like drought, but things in our control like how long we run the bath. Another species that we can learn from that's even a little closer to home is the Buick's wren. I have a picture of the Buick's wren here on the left. And the picture on the right is a graphic from the Right Bird, Right House application website that shows that in our area, this species is declining. So the Buick's wren population has declined by about 39% between 1966 and 2015, according to the North American Breeding Bird Survey. So if you live in the Buick's wren's range, like I mentioned earlier, you could use the Audubon plant finder to find plants like the American beautyberry that benefit the Buick's wren and plant those in your yard. And you can keep a brush pile in your yard to help provide necessary insects for their feeding, or you could put up a bird box that helps provide supplemental habitat for them to raise young. So there are things that we can learn from the decline in this Buick's wren that inform their needs, and our willingness to help them informs what we do in our own backyards and how we can try to help out these birds. This is a little bit of a transition here, but I wanted to go on and make sure I pointed this out. The National Audubon Society has a recent big study that they put out called Survival by Degrees, and it's using all of this data for bird ranges and habitat, and then using modeling to predict temperature rise and show the effects on the habitats of birds if the temperature rises over certain scenarios. And with a 3 degrees Celsius rise in Kerrville, they predict that drought, fall spring, urbanization, and spring heat waves would all be climate-related threats in Kerrville. And I wanted to specifically point out the fall springs for anybody who's unfamiliar. That's unseasonably warm midwinter days that trick plants into flowering early. And I'll talk a bit more about that mistiming later in the talk. And from that study, they have found those climate threats, and then they have also determined that there are 5 highly vulnerable species in the Kerr County area that with a 3 degrees Celsius rise are predicted to be highly impacted. That's the golden-fronted woodpecker, black-capped vireo, field sparrow, yellow-throated warbler, and golden-cheeked warbler. So this is a really interesting tool that helps us learn about what the future could look like under these scenarios. Again, it's not perfect, and I'll talk about some of the ways that it's not perfect, but it at least is a tool that helps inform us what we could begin to expect to learn from bird reactions to different scenarios. I wanted to talk about 2 of those birds on that list. The first is the yellow-throated warbler. This is one of my absolute favorite birds. It is so beautiful, and you can see on the map there on the right that it's got a relatively small breeding range in our area. So you can see yellow-throated warblers in Kerrville. They like riparian areas and tall trees in my experience. And this is one of the birds that Audubon has predicted would be highly vulnerable to a 3 degrees Celsius rise. And the reason they think that would be highly vulnerable is because they anticipate that 92% of its range would be lost. I did want to say, actually I'll say that later. You can see that the breeding range in our area, it would mostly be lost if the temperature rises 3 degrees Celsius. And the scientists that did this study took millions of observations from eBird and from these studies that I've pointed out that anybody can get involved with to describe where 604 American bird species live today, which is their range, and then use the latest climate models to project how the species range would shift if the temperature rises. And then also talks about some of the human impacts across the continent. So this is the result of that study for the yellow-throated warbler. Another bird that would be impacted that I try to learn a lot from because it's a very special bird is the golden-cheeked warbler. This is the last one that I'll talk about today. The golden-cheeked warbler is it breeds only in Texas, in central Texas. So every golden-cheeked warbler is truly a native Texan. All of them are born in Texas, and then their winter range is in southern Mexico and Central America. And their prime habitat is patches of 250 acres or more of old growth or mature second growth cedar, juniper, oak woodlands. So juniper is also known as cedar around here. And their habitat that they breed in has been largely cleared for land development, agricultural use, or reservoir construction. And I think there's a lot to learn from what the golden cheek warbler is telling us. This is an endangered species that has been listed and has been on the radar for a while. But it's got this very unique habitat that is in our backyards that that we can help protect and learn from the needs of this bird to ensure that it has a continued chance of survival. So examples of what I interpret as being lessons from the golden cheek warbler is that, like I said, their prime habitat is juniper oak woodlands. And in much of the hill country, there's overgrazing of oak species and hardwood species by deer, by an overpopulation of deer. So we've had generations of hardwood trees that have not been able to have their offspring thrive and survive because there are too many deer. And so we can learn that certain habitat manipulations could be made to the deer population to ensure that hardwood trees have a chance to regenerate, so that in 10, 50, or 100 years, there are hardwood trees to replace the existing hardwood trees. I know one single storm like we had a few months ago can take out many of your old Spanish oak, for example, which is also a favorite of deer to browse on. So if we aren't protecting these species, we may have the habitat now, but we won't have the habitat in the future for our kids and grandkids to enjoy if we aren't taking actions now. Another lesson to learn is just recalibrating how we view cedar and how we view dense forests. These birds need a high percentage of canopy cover from trees, and it can't just be, or it is primarily not just cedar trees, it's the mixture of oak and cedar trees. So again, that goes back to ensuring that we have oak trees and that we have a diversity of ages of oak trees and a diversity of species of oak trees to replace the oak trees that are currently there to ensure the continuation of this habitat. We need to prevent oak wilt, so that that's another thing going against our oak trees, that as oak wilt spreads, some of our oak trees are lost and we may not have the younger trees to regenerate. And the Audubon study has predicted what a range for the golden cheek warbler could look like with a 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase. I did want to say that they have on here a 73% gain in range. And they justify this by saying that the models look at the most fundamental climate needs each species requires for survival, and they do not take specific habitats into account. So, for example, a place in a grassland bird's new projected range might have the right mix of temperature and seasonality, but if that place is a forest or major city instead of a grassland, the bird is not going to thrive there. So I think this would be the case with this range gained on their model, is that they're saying it's the right mixture of climate needs, but it's not necessarily the right habitat. So you can see it's alarming that 92% of the current range, the only range that this bird breeds, could be lost. So we're learning that there's a variety of things that we need to be doing now, and then also things to anticipate, like a shift in a northern range. There's also this idea that there could become an ecological mismatch between species. So Pulich in 1976 did a comprehensive study of the golden cheek warbler and wrote a book on it. And he noted that the arrival of the golden cheek warbler appears to coincide with the budding of deciduous trees, and in turn with the presence of the first lepidopterans, which is moths and butterflies. And so if we have a mismatch in migration and the first budding of deciduous trees, for example, we could have a harmful scenario set up for golden cheek warblers to not have the food that they need and depend on. Their migration is triggered by a combination of changes in day length and lower temperatures and changes in food supplies and their genetic predisposition. But if climate is changing fast enough and causing consequences for living organisms, they could fail to adjust to the timing of the life cycle events of these lepidopterans, as there's possibly a false spring, like we mentioned, as a risk earlier, from increased temperature. So this is all things that we can be learning from the environment, from birds, about the environment. And I just want to try to take it to an application, which is my challenge to everyone on this presentation. And then there are things outside of our control. Again, like I mentioned earlier, drought. I have a drought monitor map here from 2011 when we lost a lot of juniper. We have mature cedar that died, and in the drought of the 1950s, a lot of mature cedar died. So not only do we have all the other things we've talked about to consider and to learn from, we have these other forces and factors that also are out of our control. And so I don't say all that to be dire. I just say that there are possible realities and a whole variety of factors out there, and there's so much to learn from birds. And birds can tell us so much. They can tell us about habitat loss, or changing climate, or ecological mismatches, or overhunting or overharvest, or incongruent human practices like too many windows and birds colliding into those windows, or pesticide use, or in our own backyards, a lack of food or water or shelter or a place to raise young. And this can be good, as it leads us to good things like harvest regulations on hunting, or international or national bird protection acts, or habitat protection from national parks or state parks or wildlife management areas. And what is good for the birds is likely good for us. So it's important to share a love of the natural with the next generation, who will be stewarding the impacts of our stewardship today. With that, that's all I have, and can take a few questions. Becky, were there any?
I'm sorry, I thought I unmuted myself and I didn't. Sorry about that. Yeah, I didn't. There's nothing in our chat at this moment, and so if anybody, we can go ahead and I can unmute you all if you wanted to do that, and we can just have questions out loud rather than having to type them in. So let's try that. I will unmute. You guys, and so leaving the floor open. Any questions for Kevin? This has been a fascinating talk. I think it's unfortunate that not more people realize the direct effects. And so I applaud each and every one of you for attending today, because obviously you have an interest. And so that is going to take us further into, stewarding our lands for the future. So, hey, everybody. Questions?
This is Bruce Barton. I was just curious as to, since we're seeing a picture of a painted bunting here, we just recently saw one down here at our house for the first time. I'm just wondering if their habitat is on slowly migrating from north to south, or if this is in fact a known habitat for that bird.
Kevin? Hey, Kevin,
Hey, sorry about
there you
that.
go.
Painted bunting is a bird that breeds in the Texas Hill Country, so it comes here for the spring and summer and then heads back south. And so that would be a bird. I would direct you to one of those field guides, either the National Audubon Society or the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, that would provide more specifics about the habitat needs of the painted bunting. And chances are, if you saw it, that it is breeding or feeding and breeding near your yard.
Cool. Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, just to kind of jump in there, Kevin, you had said something earlier about, watching on the map, the latitude go up as climate is warming up. And I think one of the real examples of that is our crested caracara. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that was a valley bird, and we didn't, it was never sighted here, but it's almost commonplace now to see that specific, bird that's not really, meant for this area.
Right. And raptors are one of the few types of birds that in that study is increasing. If I recall, raptors have increased by 200%. So while 1 in 4 birds have been lost since 1970s, raptors are actually on the increase.
Kevin, we had have a request. If you could put the resource page back up, are you able to share that page, please?
Yes.
Because that is a wealth of information. Okay. So lots of different available resources that are at our fingertip. And I mean, what a wonderful, the age of technology, you don't have to go to the library to look it up, but you should still utilize your local library. All right, any other questions, comments, concerns for today? All right, well, I think we're gonna wrap this up and say thank you to Kevin. Excellent information that you shared with us today, and your work that you do out with the, at the camp and through the HEB Butt Foundation. We applaud you. So, yay! Thank you, one and all. And go ahead.
What type of berry did you say was the best for the Buick rim?
I had the American beautyberry on there as one of many species, I'm sure, that is native, that helps feed the Buick's wren.
Thank you.
And again, that comes from the Audubon's Plant Finder, which you can, if you just Google Audubon Plant Finder, it will get you there, and you can just put in your information, and it will have a variety of, I think, 400 species probably that would be helpful to a variety of birds.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and just one little bit of housekeeping. We have recorded this presentation, and if all goes well and the recording is sound, we will have it available for review at the Riverside Nature Center website, which is very easy to remember, riversidenaturecenter.org. So again, thank you, Kevin, very much for your sharing your expertise, and we look forward to perhaps another presentation. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank y'all.